Okay, this is our program for the week of August 4th, 2025. Samara, I do want to bring you up just because there's some news at the top from today that is worth just talking briefly about together. Germany announced that it was partially suspending arms shipments to Israel after Israel's war cabinet approved a plan for a new military campaign to fully militarize and occupy Gaza. This week, global condemnation has been pretty widespread, and Germany's move, though, is still surprising, given it is a break from a pretty steadfast position as one of Germany's closest global allies. Friedrich Merz specified that the ban on exports was related to military equipment that could be used in the Gaza Strip moving forward, which leaves open the possibility for exports for offensive equipment in future that are not used in Gaza and does not affect ongoing exports of missile defense or naval equipment. I do want to say that it's important to kind of draw this distinction. You were talking about this, we've talked about this numerous times about the difference between partial and full. Um, the just want to give a shout out to Slovenia, which we talked. I think I don't know if we talked about this last week, Samar, but it just kind of just happened on last Friday. But Slovenia became the first EU country to implement a full weapons trade ban with Israel. And also this week introduced a ban on imports of goods that are produced in Israeli occupied Palestinian territories, in addition to approving a additional aid package for Palestinians in Gaza. Slovenia has been one of the few EU countries that has been consistent in speaking up on the situation in Palestine. And also, this is brings up this kind of question about the distinction between offensive and defensive weapons. I'm hoping, Samra, you will help us clarify a little bit today, as you have so many times in the past, what this particular carve out means. Of course, we said this is Friedrich Merz again, sort of specifying that this is about military equipment going to Gaza moving forward. This also brings up, this what we were talking about recently. And this is not me using this not flattering photo of AOC. This is probably the photo that was used the most often in all of the articles, panning her middling and meddling responses around supporting defensive aid to Israel. But as we all remember from just a few weeks ago, AOC, uh, was, one of the, made this decision to support Israel's Iron Dome. And so again, we're here again talking a little bit and drawing a distinction between the offensive and defensive weapons that are still being exported to Israel. Um, Still, I do want to just note that it's insufficient, but again, it is consequential for Germany to make this move. Since 2016, moving into 2024, Germany has consistently made increasing percentages of their of Israel's arms imports are coming from Germany, including torpedoes and naval equipment, up to most recently it constituting a full third of Israel's arms between the United States and Germany and Italy, rather. Um, and again, there's this map that Newsweek published. Just not that Newsweek is ever a source that we use that often, but in doing some quick searching, it was one of the few that published this map, which is actually inaccurate because they have Germany, if you can see there in the middle, actually listed as a full ban, but it's not a very promising map in terms of the possibilities for more weapons bans. The blue indicates no ban, light blue is light, and then the red are full arms embargoes. And so there's a few countries, and there's much more to be done. But again, this is consequential news, Sammer, as we start our program today. I'm wondering, so many things have happened this week, as always. But starting off with this is certainly promising news, but it is also coming in response to a really incredible and awful announcement from the Israeli cabinet regarding their future plans for fuller and more complete and a new campaign to occupy Gaza completely.
Yeah, I know we always say what a week, but Woof. Just woof. I do think that even the partial weapons ban in Germany is really significant, like deeply significant. And there's always these carve outs, and it's not dissimilar to what AOC was trying to pull last week, the week before. And it wasn't the picture that I found hilarious; it was the way that she zoomed up off the bottom of the screen.
Sorry.
Uh, but I do think it's important that we understand this as a process, right? Like this is where it starts, and I think we're seeing some really meaningful movement here on a lot of those fronts, right? Like it's very given the sort of decades of integration of the like Israeli, security considerations in Western countries and in Germany and the US in particular, it's not like we're not going to see, right, going from 0 to 100. What we're going to see is this sort of gradual erosion of the expectations of the continuing arming of Israel and continued economic collaboration with Israel. So it starts with defensive weapons, like cutting off offensive weapons and or weapons that are being used in Gaza. I don't even know which one of those would be better. Um, and then it moves into like something broader, right? In the same way that it starts with, okay, clearly labeling products from illegal Israeli settlements goes to banning products from illegal Israeli settlements goes to banning Israeli products. So like the fact that Germany of all countries is here is remarkable. It's really remarkable. I don't think we can see it as anything other than a real sea change. Like it was the last country I would have expected to move like this.
Yeah, yeah. And again, there's a lot of context to this decision, so I'm sure you'll talk about it. Again, great to have you back, and with that, the floor is yours.
Thanks, Thomas. Yeah. Oh, so much this week. Really struggling to wrap my own head around it. So apologies for whatever shortcomings, but it was a particularly bloody week in Gaza this week, significantly worse than the one before it. Last week, we saw the death count go up by a little over 700, and this week it went up by over 1,000. So that's like a almost 50% increase from the week before. I also wanted to highlight this report from uh, the FAO at the UN, the Food and Agriculture Organization that uh, did an analysis of Gaza's farmland that showed that about 1.5% of all of Gaza's farmland is currently accessible and undamaged. That so 98.5% are either damaged or inaccessible. And so like, the idea of again manufacturing the starvation and forcing it forward really feels like a inevitable conclusion when you look at something like this. It's worth noting that there is an additional approximately 10% of farmland that is undamaged. So all in all, 10% of Gaza's farmland is still sort of, capable of like agrarian use. But that is in areas that Israel has cordoned off from Palestinians to be able to enter. And you can see, obviously this not accessible areas in yellow is 75% of Gaza at this point. But most of the remaining arable land is in Deir al-Balah, which we talked about a lot a couple of weeks ago when the Israeli military started moving in there, right? It's one of the only areas with remaining infrastructure at any real scale. In northern Gaza, as you can sort of see from the map, like 98% of the farmland has been completely destroyed. So that's sort of like, genocidal campaign in the north is accelerating. And what that means for both Deir al-Balah and the north, given this new occupation um, plan that the Israeli military is putting forward, is something we'll get into in more detail, of course, when we get to the section about how that is a material departure from the way things have been. But starting with, the aid situation, the airdrops that have been taking place over the last couple of weeks, we've talked a lot about how airdrops are insufficient and extremely expensive and unsustainable. Um, and it's worth noting that they did operate at some pretty significant scale here, right? Like, according to the Israelis, so, we should probably cut that number pretty significantly. But according to the Israelis, 136 packages were dropped by aerial aid drop-offs. Each package is about a ton of aid. So, like, based on the needs in Gaza, that's assuming that every single one of those packages had a ton of aid in it and that they all landed somewhere where it was accessible and that Palestinians were able to access it. I mean, it didn't like fall into the sea or whatever and get ruined. That would be enough aid for all of Gaza for like a little over a month, right? A little under 2 months. Um, but A, we know that that number is probably not that high. B, a significant portion of it either fell into the sea or fell into areas that Palestinians can't access. And on top of that, the ability to distribute it across, whomever in population centers, there's nobody distributing the aid, right? They're just dropping giant pallets. So it doesn't accomplish that. It doesn't accomplish anywhere near that. And the only way to really effectively end this state of acute starvation is obviously by opening up the land corridors, which is something that Israel continues to block. Um, yeah, and just like on its face, the absurdity of the argument that, oh, we can't let in aid because Hamas is stealing it, but we'll airdrop aid where there's no security forces anywhere around, and like that is okay, if aid were being pilfered, that's almost the best conceivable way to do it, right? Is to drop it off in the middle of nowhere and let whoever has access to like trucks and resources grab it and then resell it or whatever. So it's very likely that a lot of this aid actually ended up in the hands of some of the armed groups that Israel has been funding and arming in order to further destabilize Gaza. This article in Vox, I feel like, did a really good job of explaining the underlying cruelty and the underlying violence underneath this starvation campaign and how this starvation campaign is so different than a lot of the sort of starvation stories that we've heard in various countries over the last few years. And the key piece of this, of course, is that like Israel could end it tomorrow, right? Like there's nothing standing in the way literally other than one government that's blocking all of the aid, which is already there, that, would more than sufficiently cover the needs of the people in Gaza, but Israel just won't let it in. And they do, one thing that I liked about this article is they get into the example of like what happens when Israel actually wants to do something, right? And they went into the polio campaign from last year. If folks remember, like for the first time in a quarter century, polio had reemerged in Gaza, and there was sufficient international pressure to be like, you can't let this fester, not because, Israel actually cares that Palestinians are getting polio, but because it could potentially cause like a spreading event that would then impact Israel itself. And they launched a vaccination campaign that hit over 95% of the target population to get polio vaccines, right? So like it's not hard for them to do something like that if they wanted to, and obviously they're just choosing not to. Just a good article to send any recalcitrant Zionist uncles anyone listening to this might have. Um, the like sort of drama over the starvation stories that happened this week was around a video that Hamas put out at the beginning of the week showing starving Palestinians, right? Like it just showed the fate of a lot of people who are struggling to eat and struggling to find them, basic necessities for their day. And then the video also happened to include, I think, one, but maybe two Israeli political prisoners who are also starving, unsurprisingly, given that everybody is starving. And very predictably, the entire Western media apparatus lost their minds over the video of the Israeli political prisoner starving. And that's the only thing that seemed to get any real media traction, right? And when you read stories about like, oh, Hamas posted videos of their, of hostages starving. That's like, no, they just posted videos of everyone in Gaza starving, including the political prisoners. But the fact that that doesn't even get mentioned, I think, is very telling about the sort of, the gaze of Western media. This, of course, led to a series of like shock, political reactions, including there's a UN Security Council meeting this week on the plight of Israeli hostages in Gaza. And of course, Netanyahu like losing his mind talking about how this was designed, by Hamas to like shock people into, and it's all fake. There's a New York Times giant advertisement in Times Square. If folks didn't see it, sorry, not New York Times, but in New York City, in Times Square, there's a gigantic advertisement saying that like the only people starving in Israel are the only people starving in Gaza are the hostages. So really, just like despite the fact that all of these claims are demonstrably false, right? They're really trying to ride that train. and Netanyahu basically demanding that the Red Cross, Red Crescent administer aid to the political prisoners in Gaza. Whereas, like, it was you, it was literally Netanyahu, right, who blocked all of these humanitarian aid organizations from operating in the country, inside Gaza. And so, Hamas responded to that, right, and basically saying, like, yeah, sure, like, you want to let the Red Cross in, that would be great. Like, you just need to allow for a humanitarian corridor for them to come in, and they're welcome to do that. So, just again, I think really shows the sort of underlying hypocrisy of that whole thing. One of the other things that happened as a consequence of these aid drops, incidentally, was that for the first time in a long time, international journalists basically got more or less direct footage. So, like, international journalists flying on Israeli or U.S. planes that were conducting these airdrops were prohibited from filming or photographing Gaza from above. But in on a Jordanian plane, some journalists from ITV, like a UK news outlet, were able to do it. And like, I definitely recommend looking at this article. It's a really good example, I think, of what proper journalism in the face of something like this actually looks like, and among other things, the article notes like this looks like another world, right? Like the destruction here is otherworldly, but it's not, right? It's this world, and it's the world that we have created. And what has happened in Gaza might be one of the darkest eras in like the world that we have created, and a stain that'll endure on humanity for generations. Which, like, yes, it's nice to finally hear something like that coming out of Western media outlets. In terms of what's been happening with the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation, some really big updates this past week, including really a fever pitch now of calls from the UN, from Doctors Without Borders, and a bunch of other institutions that are basically accusing the GHF directly of complicity with genocide and calling for its immediate dismantling. And these, there has previously been a lot of criticism of the GHF. There's previously been a lot of refusal to cooperate with the GHF. This is the first time I think that at this scale people are talking directly about um, the fact that it needs to no longer exist as soon as possible. And in the face of that pressure, very unsurprisingly, perhaps the US responds to the pressure and tacks in the exact opposite direction. So basically, what it seems like, and it's a little early to say because the pronouncements have all been very vague, but it seems like the US is basically taking over the GHF like logistical operations plan. So, Steve Witkoff did this sort of cursory visit into Gaza and came out of it claiming that the United States was going to be quadrupling the number of food distribution sites that the GHF operates, which, like, this was supposed to be, the GHF is ostensibly like a non-political actor, right? That's not tied to either the United States or Israel. But, like, as we all know, and as is even clearer now, when the United States government can basically speak on behalf of what the GHF is going to do, they are claiming to be doing a pretty massive scaling up of what the GHF is doing. And I think this is one of those things that cuts two ways, right? Because on the one hand, that is an objective improvement, right? Like one of the worst things about the GHF is the way that it is forcing people to go to these four existing aid sites, three of which are in like the far south of Gaza. Um, and, like, obviously you can't serve 2 million people from four distribution sites. And so 16 distribution sites, while still wildly inadequate, is a much better number. And, we don't know where they're going to be, but presumably they would be more geographically dispersed, which reduces that pressure for, forced displacement into the south. They're also supposed to be open much longer. Some of the distribution sites ostensibly will now be open for 24 hours. But there's no real plan here that anyone has seen, right? This is just a pronouncement made by US government officials, so it's not really clear whether or not it'll happen in the way that they're saying it will. And secondly, and more troublingly, the entire idea of the GHF, right? And the entire idea of a humanitarian distribution body that's tied to one of the combatants, or rather tied to the two parties that are you know, um, like actually committing the genocide here is not a sustainable way to run this thing. And so, like, reform isn't the thing we need from the GHF. So even though it's getting better, I don't know that, obviously we want it to be better in the sense that we want it to be able to serve as many Palestinians as possible. So we want as few Palestinians as possible to starve to death. And um, this can't be the thing that reduces pressure on the GHF to shut down, right? And to let the UN and other international aid organizations resume the role that they're supposed to be playing here. So it's a bit, it's a slightly tricky narrative tightrope to walk where, like, yeah, a good development, but A, nowhere near enough, and B, still totally illegitimate in its underlying operations and considerations. So something that we need to sort of think about how to message. In the face of all of this pressure, as folks I'm sure have seen, the big news this week was that, this sort of long simmering plan, which, frankly, harkens back to, if folks have been listening to the PSAs for a while now, the general's plan that we were talking about many, many months ago is now really coming to the fore in a new way. So this idea of, the full occupation of Gaza is something that has been bandied around for a while, like well over a year, but really sort of hit a fever pitch last week when it seemed like, okay, this is what they're actually going to do. And then this week, the cabinet just approved it today, I believe. Um, so it does seem to be going into effect sometime soon. And I'm sure some folks are like a little confused by this and or um, don't know how much stake to put in it because, like, what does that even mean for Israel to be occupying Gaza? Like, they're clearly already there and they've clearly already occupied Gaza. But nevertheless, this is actually a really significant difference in their operating procedures in Gaza, in a way that, like, it's really hard to overstate. Because the difference really, there's two differences that I'd say that are key here. One is the area that Israeli military forces cover, and the second is the way that the Israeli military forces conduct themselves within the areas that they ostensibly control. So right now, based on the existing plan of what they were doing, and we've talked about this a lot in past PSAs, right now the plan is full control over three-quarters of Gaza, right? 75%, and I think that number is supposed to go up to 80%. But that remaining 25%, where most Palestinians are supposed to be like pushed into, um, and like that falls relatively outside of the purview of like occupation forces. Obviously the remaining 25% gets bombarded by air and sea fairly regularly, but they're not like directly under the control of the Israeli military. The full occupation means that nope, there's nowhere left, right? There's nowhere that the Israeli military ground forces will not be situated. And so what that means for the, particularly areas like the Al-Mawasi, like massively overcrowded population centers where all of the Palestinians in Gaza have been displaced. Um, it's unclear what it means for those people, like what happens when the Israelis come in. And so like the few remaining areas of Deir el-Belah, for example, that we've been talking about for a couple of weeks now, that remained relatively untouched. Again, ground troops moving in there. And then similarly, um, the reoccupation of like say Gaza City and areas in the north where Palestinians continue to be, uh, despite like all of these, deportation orders and the evacuation warnings and whatnot. Those areas might be emptied out again. So that's one difference, right? The space in which the Israeli military is operating. The second difference is like where the military will be and what their responsibilities are. So um, right now, Israel doesn't conduct itself as an occupying force, in the sense that like think about like the US occupation of Iraq, right? Or even like Israel's occupation of the West Bank in 67, right? Where occupying the area means that you take over control over its security and whatever, right? Like your forces are a somewhat permanent presence. Right now, Israeli forces only operate in really narrow corridors that like cut Gaza into all of these different pieces, and then they launch operations from those corridors into population centers or other areas, and then go back to the corridors when they're done. The full occupation ends that, right? It basically means that no, they're just going to be everywhere, right? They're going to set up operating posts across the Gaza Strip, which leaves them, you know, two like really big consequences of that. One, they technically now have the responsibility for security in Gaza in a way that they didn't up to this point. Obviously there are, international human rights obligations isn't something that Israel seems to care about at all. Nevertheless, right? Like it's going to be hard for them to make any arguments about the, chaotic situation in Gaza if they themselves call themselves fully occupying the territory, right? That's the big difference there. So that's one piece. And the other piece is obviously it leaves them way more exposed, right? Like they can't do this sort of hit and run and then hide in the areas they control. And so like I would expect, and you sort of hear Israeli forces talking around this, but I would expect casualties in the IDF to increase dramatically as a result of this occupation, right? It's not really clear what it achieves beyond the sort of, political attempt to show like some sort of change in the underlying operating procedures, and obviously as a gesture to the hard right elements of the Netanyahu administration, who have been calling for the full occupation of Gaza for a long time. And so the Israeli military has been really against this plan. There's been some very public fights between like the head military and security officials and the Netanyahu cabinet, including, dragging in Netanyahu's son into the whole thing in ways that are weird and funny to read. But there has not been any pushback from the U.S. administration. So, given that, I think it's very likely that we're going to see this move ahead in really meaningful ways. What that's going to look like, it's going to be hard to know specifically, but we will know very soon. So, like by the next PSA, we'll have a much better sense of what's happening with this and where it's going. It's worth noting the level of fatalism that's coming out of the Israeli security apparatus as a result of a lot of this. So, like 19, I think, senior and former security officials in Israel wrote this joint letter, basically saying, uh, "We're losing, we're losing, and this is going to make us lose even faster." And like one of the things that they say is like, they say that the Israeli forces are on the precipice of defeat. And at this point, all they're doing is offsetting existing losses. And then what I found to be a shockingly accurate statement, the letter says, "What the world sees today is of our own creation. We are hiding behind a lie that we wrought. This lie was sold to the Israeli public, but the world has long since understood that it doesn't reflect the real picture." Right? And again, these aren't like peaceniks. This is the Israeli security apparatus. So I think really goes to show the extent to which operationally and politically, this has been a really, really disastrous set of events for the Israeli government and Israel as a state, frankly. And so, in the shadow of all of that, right, we've been seeing this ever increasing recognition of the fact that what is happening is a genocide. This, article in Current Affairs, I think, is a really interesting one that gets into like, okay, everyone is starting to call it a genocide. Why haven't U.S. politicians done it yet? And, spends a lot of time talking about Bernie Sanders in particular. Um, and sitting with the complexity of like Bernie Sanders by far, right? Like by far, the most, um, I don't know if aligned is the right word, right? But like the most willing to cut off arms sales and to isolate Israel and whatever out of anyone in the Senate, right? And like, does that balance out in any way his unwillingness to use the word genocide? And like, partly I wonder how much of this is when, whatever vestiges of Zionism continue to exist in our dear senator from Vermont. But part of it I do think is also political strategy in the sense that like genocide, when Bernie says like genocide is a legal term, I interpret that a couple of different ways. One is like him trying to hand wave away the fact that yeah, it is a legal term, but that is what it is. Like it's a legal term that is being met by the current conditions, but also a legal term that comes with a series of obligations that might make it a lot harder to maneuver, right? So if the United States government in any way recognizes that it is a genocide, then again, the United States government becomes complicit in a genocide, which makes it, I think, much less likely for existing U.S. senators and whatnot to be willing to say, go on record for something that acknowledges that, because then if they're acknowledging that it's a genocide and they've been sending weapons, it puts them in a really bad situation, which they deserve to be in. But also, our goal here is get that arms embargo passed. So, like, if we need to use different language to get through to the senators, personally, I'm kind of okay with it. Jeremy Ben-Ami from J Street, the so-called liberal version of AIPAC, after a fascinating conversation um, with Mehdi Hassan, where 2 days ago he refused to like sort of acknowledge basically accused people of calling it a genocide, of hurting American Jews' feelings. 2 days later came around and was like, okay, you know what? It is a genocide. So the fact that even J Street, which by the way went hard on like the APAC line after October 7th, has come around this way, I think really says something quite meaningful. This list at Zeteo, I think, is a great one to just keep track of because they're just tracking all of the politicians, organizations, and human rights groups and like genocide experts that have officially called it a genocide. So this is just a good thing to keep tabs on. You can see here this is the full list of U.S. politicians that have called it a genocide, and it's pretty thin. Um, but I think we are going to see that list grow very, very quickly in the next few weeks. This article in The Nation, I just also wanted to flag because I think it's a good one that like really gets into this idea that um, more than anything else in this moment, like this issue with Palestine really highlights the underlying hypocrisy of the US political system, right? Where you have the overwhelming mass of people that all feel one way, and then a tiny political elite um, that are still adamant on like maintaining and funding and backing this genocide. And like, what does that mean for how this political system, like that can't, as the article says, something has to give, right? Like that dynamic can't last forever. And like, who's going to win in this game of like a tiny, tiny group of people that want this genocide to continue and the overwhelming masses of folks who are, um, more than ready for it to end. So a good article that like gets into the intricacies of that. In Europe, we already talked a little bit about the German arms sales stuff, so I won't spend too much time on that other than, to once again note that it's a really big deal. On the flip side of that was something that I feel like really brought back to mind for me the Mohammed al-Kurd event that Iraq Action and CPE held a few weeks ago, where a student from Gaza is accused of saying anti-Semitic things, not even actually reposting things that are considered to be anti-Semitic. If folks have actually seen what this person said, I would love to know because I looked and I could not find it. But it's almost sort of beside the point. So not only are they deporting that student, but they've cut all evacuations from Gaza. So France is no longer helping anyone get out of Gaza because one person said something that was anti-Semitic. And this really, I feel like, goes back to the thing that Mohammed al-Kurd was talking about in a way that I feel like is really important for us to reflect on, which is, you know, obviously, like in our movements, there is no space for anti-Semitism. There's no space for any like hatred or bigotry of any kind. And let's say this person did say something anti-Semitic, right? Then what? Like, they deserve to die. They deserve to be killed as a result of that. And then, like, all other Palestinians have to now bear the weight of one person saying something that's anti-Semitic, and somehow that's something that carries more political weight than the actual murder of 1,000 people every week, right? And just the way that that plays out, I feel like is a real horror show that, it was hard not to read that article without thinking of all the things that Muhammad was talking about at that event. Also, there's hopefully a recording of that at some point, just to note. Um, the other big thing from Europe, obviously, these past couple weeks has been the statehood push. And without getting too much into it, last week we talked a little bit about why the statehood push is also itself a little bit double-edged. Like, obviously, it's a thing that Israel is very upset about, and it is used as a sort of tool for normalization. Um, and like an attempt to return to the sort of like failed two-state model that clearly doesn't exist anymore. So Noura Harakat in Jaddaliya has a really, really good article on this. That's the second one here, the statehood trap. So I definitely recommend folks give that a read if you want to get a sense of what's happening with this big statehood push. Outside of the political class, there's also, obviously this deep complicity happening with tech companies and the sort of consultant elite, where the big bombshell this week from 972 magazine gets into almost brain-breaking levels of surveillance being conducted through the use of Microsoft and Microsoft's partnership with the IDF, where they are they designed a system that intercepts up to 1 million calls per hour of people in Palestine. And they have now logged 200 million hours of phone calls on Microsoft servers of like everyday average Palestinian citizens talking to each other. And so like that level of complicity inside of this sort of like broader genocidal project. And they're using that obviously um, for like as an underlying analysis for airstrikes, raids, you name it, right? Targeted assassinations, whatever. And so yeah, just a reminder of why Microsoft is near the top of the BDS list for all the horrors that it's committing. Um, and then similarly, new information about the Boston Consulting Group coming out. We've already seen a lot of the sort of, um, not only their complicity in the Gaza Humanitarian Foundation stuff, not only their complicity in the sort of relocation plans that they had come up with a few months ago before they pulled out of the project, but this week was leaked the like their proposal for kicking out Palestinians in Gaza to Somalia and then building like luxury real estate in Gaza, like turning it into this like whatever, high value real estate area. Just basically the exact Trump plan being modeled by the Boston Consulting Group. So great job, BCG. There's a protest, I think, in front of the BCG office in San Francisco this weekend, put on by PYM. So folks should check out the AROC calendar for more details on that. Meanwhile, the sort of collapse of the Zionist force in the United States has been something that has been absolutely breathtaking to behold. Um, this article in Unheard, I think, does a good job of like getting into some of the how uh, the sort of multi-party consensus around Israel is just collapsing in front of our eyes. New York Magazine had a great article about the crisis at the ADL, and how like Jonathan Greenblatt's prioritization of fighting anti-Zionism over everything else has basically caused the entire organization to not only lose its mooring, but like, there's a huge morale crisis and it's lost its credibility in all of these places, et cetera, et cetera. Similarly, within the Democratic Party, I love this CNN article about pro-Israel Democrats trying to break with Netanyahu to stop the party shift. By the way, just the fact that CNN has to say pro-Israel Democrats is like such a huge development because, a year ago that would have been like just repetitive, right? Like obviously all Democrats are pro-Israel Democrats. So that's something, right? Like the fact that they need to make that distinction matters. And then, this highlights a thing that I feel like Schumer was trying to do a little too early last year, which is like try to pin all of this on Netanyahu, despite the fact that, what his actions in Gaza have the approval of like 80% of Israelis or more based on recent polling. So this is obviously not a Netanyahu issue. This is obviously an Israel issue. And so like, again, in terms of narrative strategy and importance, it's really critical that we don't let that become we're not talking about one person who is the scapegoat for this genocide in Gaza, right? There's an entire apparatus behind making this happen, and all of it needs to be held to account. Um, also, I was very intrigued by this signing of the Block the Bombs Act by Valerie, I don't know how to pronounce her last name, Fushi, um, because among other things, Valerie Fushi, the congresswoman, is a massive recipient of APAC support. I think they spent something like over $2 million on her congressional campaign in 2022. And not only has she now signed the act to block offensive weapons to Israel, she has stated publicly that she will not be accepting any more APAC money. So it just goes to show that the pressure that's being put on members of Congress around block the bombs is having really meaningful impacts. And like, way to go, APAC, you spent $2 million getting a candidate elected who now is trying to block all weapons to Israel. So progress, well, offensive weapons. But again, this is, I think, where we start. And on the Republican side too, the most incredible news to me this week out of everything was that the Trump administration's plan to tie FEMA support, a lot of people I'm sure saw this, to tie FEMA support to states uh, that aren't doing any sort of like BDS against Israel, collapsed spectacularly. Like in just a few days, there was enough pushback, not only from the general public, but within the MAGA movement itself, um, that the administration had to reverse course on this and say, like, okay, never mind. Like, we're not, in fact, going to tie FEMA funds to states' positions on boycotting Israeli goods. So huge, absolutely huge, right? Like the fact that that was so untenable that it only lasted a couple of days before it fell apart. And just to say, this is something I could have imagined Biden doing too, and like I can imagine Biden having stuck with it despite how much people hated it. So again, just goes to show the weirdness of the moment that we're in. Um, there are now ads, there are congressional ads being run again. Like this is an ad against Ruben Gallego, the Arizona senator, for skipping the vote on the JRDs. So like the fact that this is becoming such a liability that like people can run ads against politicians for not stopping the genocide. Again, speaks to a new level of vulnerability here that's really valuable. And in the face of that, of course, you're seeing like all these members of Congress going to Israel for their recess, right? Instead of sitting with their constituents this summer, they're literally just in Israel schmoozing with Netanyahu. A huge week on the BDS front. There's so many developments, and this is just like a slice of them. The International Sociological Association has suspended their like Israeli subcomponent because of that, the like ISS's refusal to condemn genocide. Israel announced a series of new sanctions and bilateral trade stoppages, including the suspension of all military exports to Israel, um, controls over goods that are coming from Israel, illegal settlements, and could potentially the suspension of the free trade agreement that Brazil has with Israel. Really big steps from a large economy. Um, the University of Maryland had to pay a settlement to the Students for Justice in Palestine there for the way that they were treated. The Artists for Palestine UK, like folks may have seen last week, the performer at the Royal Ballet and Opera holding up a Palestinian flag, and the director of the opera trying to yank it off the stage, and he kept holding it to rapturous applause from the audience. The Royal Ballet and Opera has now canceled all of their future performances in Israel. So, like, huge, great, very exciting. And in the context of all of this, continuing massive shifts in the way that people perceive what's happening in Gaza and Israel's actions generally, where now the plurality of voters do think that what's happening in Gaza is a genocide, um, up significantly from a year ago. And at this point, almost, overwhelmingly within the Democratic Party and for independents. For Democrats, I think it's like 4-1 or 5-1 at this point that think that a genocide is in fact occurring. And I think there's a really important strategic lesson to take from this, where I think there was a lot of wrangling and a lot of like a lot of concern like a year and a half ago that we were using the language of genocide was alienating people because they didn't think what was happening was a genocide, and we had to meet them where they were and blah blah blah. But like, or those people would eventually come around, right? And I think it's really important that we have stuck to this messaging of genocide because people have eyes and ears, and like eventually it really becomes impossible to deny what folks are seeing every day, at least most people. So really speaks to the importance of calling the thing what it is. And then similarly, there's a huge, huge push, even from most Republicans, uh, that this like blockade and starvation of Gaza needs to end. And so that those are two data points that I think we can really work with as we do some like electoral engagement and whatnot. So to sum up, the occupation of Gaza really is a significant escalation, even if it doesn't necessarily feel like it, given how horrible things are already. But I would say it also comes with a series of logistical and political issues for the occupiers, right? That they're not going to be able to handle very easily. And so we need to be ready, I think, in terms of how we respond to developments in Gaza, as the Israeli government changes their tack as well. The Gaza Humanitarian Foundation continues to orchestrate the genocide. They're a key player in the ethnic cleansing. And so, like, this path of reforming it is is dangerous, right? And I think we need to think about the most effective ways of making sure that we maximize aid to Palestinians and don't allow that shouldn't come at the cost of like continued ethnic cleansing and forced displacement. So how we hold both of those things will matter. Um, we are finally seeing material consequences of Israel's pariah status, right? Like the stuff in Slovenia, the arms shipment cutoffs in Germany, the breaking of trade agreements. Like these are all starting to accelerate in a really meaningful way. And we like the pressure needs to stay on for that not to be the sort of temporary blip, but to be the beginning of an entire sort of paradigm shift, right? And then in the US domestically, the support for the genocide has really collapsed. And so like now feels like a really, really critical moment to be pushing for the arms embargo, to be pushing for accountability for people who are complicit in the genocide, to be clear in our narrative, and to do political education to make sure people understand what's going on and how they can support. In terms of upcoming events, there's a Palestinian Women in Labor and Liberation fundraiser and potluck put on by Bay Area Labor for Palestine this weekend at 10 a.m. Would strongly recommend folks check that out. There's also a power hour being put on by the U.S. Campaign for Palestinian Rights, JVP Action, the IMEU Policy Project, and AROC Action, with guest participants Cynthia Nixon, Danae Benton, and Morgan Spector. That's this upcoming Tuesday at 7 a.m. Pacific, which I know is a little bit early, but at least it won't interrupt your workday. So hope to see you there. And if you want to hear about other events, please check out the AROG calendar at bit.ly/Gaza events. If you want to sign up for text message updates, please text PSA to 833-633-0604 and check out the PAL Media Tracker for the articles that inform this analysis. You can sign up for a weekly digest of these articles at palmediatracker.com/signup. And that's the end of it. Thank you all so much.
Samer, thanks so much. Great to hear about all those BDS victories.